Chapter 13, the Central Nervous System, Part 1. So, as we know, the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is made up of four main regions, two of them being the cerebrum and the brainstem, and then of course the spinal cord is the spinal cord. One thing to notice is the arrangement of gray and white matter in the brain and the spinal cord are different. In the cerebrum, the biggest portion of the brain, the gray matter is on the outside primarily, and the white matter is primarily on the inside of the brain. So the processing on the outside surface of the brain, the information being carried inside, with a few exceptions, these little nuclei found inside the white matter. In the brain stem, a smaller portion of the brain that connects to the spinal cord, we see that the gray matter is moving almost exclusively to inside the brain, and the white matter is moving to the outside. And by the time we get to the spinal cord down here, the gray matter is all internal on the inside, and the white matter is on the outside, which makes sense because the spinal cord is receiving and sending out wires, commands, information to and from the body. Here is the brain. The brain has four main parts. The biggest wrinkly part here is the cerebrum. There's a smaller region internal called the diencephalon that you can only see if you cut the brain in half. There's the brainstem that connects to the spinal cord, and this other smaller wrinkly mass called the cerebellum. Also, we're pointing out here that there is the seahorse structure. Here's the head of the seahorse, the neck of the seahorse, the belly, and the tail. I'll refer to the seahorse, and I'm talking about where certain things are, but it will not be on any exam. This is not a marine biology class. All right, the brainstem. The brainstem, as I mentioned, connects the brain to the spinal cord. So at the end of the brainstem is the spinal cord. So it is the thing that carries all the information to and from the spinal cord to and from the rest of the brain. And coming off of the brainstem are these little bitty structures. These are 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The brainstem is broken down into three main regions. You have the medulla oblongata. This is the most inferior portion. Within the medulla oblongata, it houses such vital functions of the body, such as breathing, rate of digestion, rate of heartbeat, so very critical for living. And of course, all information going to and from the spinal cord has to pass through the medulla oblongata. Within the medulla oblongata is an area where the information going to and from the spinal cord cross over, so that information from the right side goes to the left side of the brain, and information on the left side goes to the right side of the brain. This is referred to as the decussation of the pyramids. So the decussation of the pyramids is where in the medulla oblongata, information is crossed over from the left and right sides of the body. That's why the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body and vice versa. The pons. The pons is the middle portion of the brain stem. It attaches to the cerebellum. So most, but not all, of the attachments to the cerebellum occurs at the pons. And the pons also helps regulate some autonomic functions, important functions like how deep we breathe. And then the most superior portion of the brain stem is the midbrain. The midbrain connects directly to the diencephalon and the cerebrum. So the midbrain connects to both the diencephalon and the cerebrum. It coordinates some movements of the body, and it's important in relaying visual and auditory reflexes. So a visual reflex, for instance, something darts into your field of vision, suddenly zooming at you, you will automatically jerk, move, respond to that before you even know what it is you see. Auditory reflex, if you hear a really loud noise, you'll jump and sort of turn toward that noise. So the midbrain is important for visual and auditory reflexes. The midbrain, on its posterior side, has these four little bumps. These four little bumps are called the corpora quadrigemina, and they are where you find the visual reflex center and the auditory reflex center. So those reflex centers are in the corpora quadrigemina. Also, the midbrain has what are called the cerebral peduncles on its lateral sides and anterior side. The cerebral peduncles are how it connects to the cerebrum. So this is the physical connection between the cerebrum and the midbrain. We have the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a smaller, wrinkly mass. It attaches to the posterior side of the brain stem, and it has two hemispheres. The cerebellum's functions revolve around movements. So, for instance, it receives information from the cerebrum on what movements the cerebrum is going to command, the cerebrum is going to have happen. Then, cerebellum compares what's going on, what is actually happening with the movement, to what the cerebrum wanted. And then, if there's a discrepancy, the cerebellum adjusts, makes corrections, so that what it is we want to do is what we actually do. So the cerebellum makes sure that the movements that we are doing match what it was the cerebrum wanted us to do. If the cerebellum is damaged or otherwise is unable to function, you can develop ataxia. Ataxia is a loss of ability to coordinate muscular movements. So you might be trying to reach for something and you'll be off a little, so you'll knock things over. You'll have trouble walking in a straight line. If you close your eyes or were blindfolded, you would not be able to touch your nose with your finger because you would not be able to coordinate that movement. It can be caused by damage to the cerebellum, or it can be caused by getting drunk. So the non-fun part of being drunk, it'd be called ataxia. Diencephalon. Diencephalon is the head of the seahorse. It is completely surrounded by the cerebrum, and the diencephalon attaches to the midbrain. So here are the two hemispheres or halves of the diencephalon. We cut off the cerebrum. The diencephalon has a few portions. The central portion or head of the seahorse, that is called the thalamus. All sensory information passes through the thalamus. So all sensory information coming from the spinal cord, all sensory information coming from cranial nerves pass through the thalamus except smell. Olfaction or smell does not go through the thalamus. It bypasses the thalamus. So the thalamus acts as a relay station for sensory information. And in the thalamus, it can increase or decrease that sensory signal depending on whether it views that as being important or not. The hypothalamus or beak of the seahorse is connected to the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland will be hanging off of the hypothalamus. It is next to the optic chiasm, so this here is the optic chiasm, which happens to be where the two optic nerves come together. The hypothalamus has a lot of functions related to things we don't normally control, so it has a lot of control to the autonomic nervous system. It can affect heart rate and sweating and other things that we don't normally consciously think of. It regulates body temperature, so our 98.7 degree Fahrenheit temperature is determined by the hypothalamus, and it raises that when we have an infection. It regulates hunger and thirst. It controls our sleep-wake cycles, so that when we get sleepy at night when it's dark, wake up more aware during the day. It controls the endocrine system, the system that produces hormones. It controls our emotional responses, so it's involved in our emotional responses to things. It controls our motivation, our wanting to do something. So it's very important for, say, staying on top of your work in your anatomy class. And it also has a role in the formation of memories. So the hypothalamus is extremely important, primarily for things we don't think about too much. Finally, the third portion of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. Epithalamus posterior to the thalamus, sort of the back of the head of the seahorse. It includes within it the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a gland that produces the hormone melatonin, and the function of melatonin is to initiate the getting sleepy function. So melatonin is produced when we do not see any light with our eyes, and then it goes to the hypothalamus and says, hey, time to make this person sleepy. All right, the cerebrum has two hemispheres, a right and left hemisphere. They are separated by a space called the longitudinal fissure. So that is the longitudinal fissure between the left and right hemispheres. The cerebrum is very wrinkly. The folds coming up are called one gyrus or many gyri. The crevices going down are called one sulcus or many sulci. So sort of like the mountains are the gyruses and the valleys are the sulci. There are 5 hemispheres to the cerebrum. 5 hemispheres. You have the frontal lobe. It is anterior, or the front lobe, underneath the frontal bones. This would be the frontal bone, frontal lobe. At the posterior end of the frontal lobe is the precentral gyrus, this strip of brain tissue, the precentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus is then next to what's called the central sulcus, an important groove in the proximate middle top of the cerebrum. The functions of the frontal lobe include such things as motor control. So the precentral gyrus controls motor control, motor commands the skeletal muscles. It includes planning and thinking, reasoning, personality, speech. Frontal lobe is very much the thinking, the U lobe. Parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is sort of in the top middle of the cerebrum, sort of underneath the parietal bones. The strip on the anterior end of the parietal lobe is called the postcentral gyrus. Postcentral gyrus is where all of the general somatic sensory information arrives. So all the senses associated with your skin, touch, tickle, itch, so temperature, and so on, that information goes to the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. There is the lateral sulcus, a little groove here that separates a little bit the temporal lobe from the parietal and frontal lobes. Temporal lobe on the lateral sides. Temporal lobe is important for hearing. Hearing is localized to it. Smell, olfaction is localized to it, and also has some important roles in memory. Of course, the frontal lobe does as well. The occipital lobe is the posterior lobe of the cerebrum near the occipital bone, and it has the main sensory area for vision. So we see with the eyes in the front of our head, and the information goes to the back of the head, the occipital lobe. The fifth lobe is the insula. The insula is deep within the cerebrum. You cannot see it on the surface. You have to cut away to get to it. It is found deep within the lateral sulcus, and its function is where the sense of taste or gustation goes to. So the sense of taste is localized to the insula. Other structures important for the cerebrum. So here's the cerebrum. We have the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is the structure that connects the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. We have the septum pellucidum. Septum pellucidum is a wall that separates the right and left lateral ventricles. Lateral ventricles are spaces filled with cerebral spinal fluid. There is the olfactory bulb. Olfactory or smell information goes from the nasal cavity, and those nerves synapse in the olfactory bulb. So now the sensory information, the sense of smell, arrives in the cerebrum. Then it travels down the olfactory tract to the temporal lobe, so that we are officially aware of that smell sensation. Again, if you cut the cerebrum with a nice coronal section, you can see the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex is the gray matter on the surface of the cerebrum. So cerebral cortex, gray matter on the surface. And then on the inside is, of course, the white matter, the wires that are carrying the information around within the cerebrum and from the cerebrum to the spinal cord and lower portions of the brain. And that will be it for this portion of the lecture. Be sure to continue with part 2.